man of many inclinations. Right. So I wanted to read a fantastical story, and I realized that all of my fantastical stories exceeded the time limit. So on the car ride here, I took my story, The Father and the Father, which was published in Conjunctions, and I chopped 2 pages out ruthlessly. If you want to read the whole thing, Google is your friend. You can find it online. So hopefully you won't notice that I chopped 2 pages out on the car ride on the way here.
Were you driving?
No, I wasn't actually John's side. I'm tempted to answer yes, but too many people know the truth. I'll start. We turned and we turned, and as we turned, my father became one of the void-eyed horses that never stops galloping. I mean that for a moment my father stood so motionless beside me that it seemed as though he had been born on the carousel and would never leave it. And I wondered for that moment if I would have to leave and he would have to stay because he was born there and I was not. I was 7 years old. It was a Monday, a President's Day, a day off from school. When the carousel finally did stop, my father clicked into motion and swept me with a laugh off the horse's back and through the holographic garden into the rink, where we joined some teenagers in a murder of mothers with tottering children younger than me. I spotted another father, skating with a daughter slightly older than me, and I saw, without really seeing, that he was of the same model as my father. On the ice, my father skated with the gliding certainty of a hockey player, his blades seeming to always know just how to touch the ice. I think this is an amazing quality of hockey players. Anyway, he went around and around. I did not think of the carousel, and after a suitable time, he announced that he was going to let go of my hand. "No!" I cried, "don't leave me!" I looked up at him, trying to say please with my eyes, but his gaze seemed to cultivate a small distance between us. It was a distance that I never saw in the eyes of my mother, and I knew she would never let go of my hand unless I asked her to. "It's you. You're the ones leaving me," he said, teasing. He was letting go and moving away, and before I could plead with him a second time, I was sailing alone across the ice, my ankles bending, my arms turning like a lonely weather vane. The ice rink enlarged, and inside of it I was even smaller. "Daddy!" I cried again, desperate and yet also thrilled in my childish way. He was skating further away from me into the center of the rink where overweight girls in tights and colossal men with ponytails practiced toe loops and double axels. "Come on, Ryan," said my father. "I've seen you do it before." He was right. I had skated on my own many times in similar circumstances. Each time, I hated it. As I straggled across the ice, one of the teenagers whizzed past me, yelling in a way that cried, "Look at me!" He was a tall boy with a then fashionable page boy, and I saw as he turned his head over his shoulder that his eyes were small and heedless. He was looking back at, of course, a girl. She frightened me more than him, for she slanted forward in a way that hinted at calamity, and I wobbled rightward to the wall. Just as my father left the safety, I'm like trying to get through all my cuts here. Just as my father left the safety of the figure skating circle. At the corner of my vision, I perceived the teenager looping around, chased by the girl, both of them screaming. The boy's blade tip caught on a rut, and he skidded down and across the ice. He slid head first into my father's legs. My father flipped into the air and landed hard upon his head, and everyone in the rink heard the metallic clang of his cranium hitting the ice. Their eyes strayed in his direction, and the clockwork of the rink paused for a moment as they took in the situation. And they watched with me as my father's limbs twitched in a way that suggested a pinned insect instead of a man. The teenager unfolded like a fawn into a standing position, glanced at my prone father, and then laughed. He shook his arms in a grotesque imitation of my father, and the girl caterwauled with him. That broke the spell of disaster, and the teenagers and the mothers and the figure skaters resumed their rotations and turns and spirals as though my father were not lying on the ice, his arms and legs now completely still. Only the other father remained stationary as the rink resumed its indifferent turning. He stood with his daughter on the other side of the ice, looking from me to my father's body and back again. He leaned over, and they exchanged a few words. She nodded, and then skated off the ice on her own as he glided over to my father. After the other father dragged my father over the ice, and laid him across the front bleacher. More cuts, sorry. The other father skated up to my side and leaned in close, just as he had with his own child. I could see the cosmetic differences that separated him from my father. The eyes were blue, not gray, and his hair was longer and blonder. "You okay, buddy?" he said. "Yes," I remembered. "Your dad's emergency transponder activated as soon as he fell, and I'm sure your mother is on her way. You want me to call her?" My mind was white with worry. "I don't remember her number." "Why don't you sit with your dad and wait for her? The signal will take her right to where we are." He took me to sit next to my father, and I could not stand to look at him. "Do you want me to stay with you?" asked the other father. I replied no, and I meant it. In fact, the presence of this other father horrified me, and I could not look at him either. Instead, I stared down at the black rubbery floor, creased with the blades of 10,000 skates. "Okay, buddy." He placed his hand on my shoulder, and that was meant to reassure, but instead it caused me to cringe. And then he turned and crossed the ice to his daughter, who leaned against the plexiglass that wrapped the rink, watching us with, I suspected, an edge of jealousy. Neither of us had yet learned to feel ashamed of our fathers, so different from other fathers. "Dad," I said, still not looking at him. "Daddy." "Mom is coming," I told myself. Could my father be fixed? Or would he go away, to be replaced, perhaps, by a stranger? A puppet, who would only remind me of my father? I could not articulate these questions to my 7-year-old self, of course, but I could feel their presence haunting the most monstrous, but I could feel it haunting the most monstrous and incipiently grown-up corners of my mind. Still not looking, I reached over and groped along my father's hair and shoulders, hoping my touch would tell me what I needed to know. He felt as solid as ever, but he was absolutely still. I could have been touching a washing machine. A machine. He had prepared me for this moment, when I would see him for what he was, when I would turn, and as I turned, discover that my father was not, perhaps was never really there. He had tried to prepare me to be alone. "You were so calm when I got there," said my mother, laughing years later when I was visiting my mother and my father from the city where adulthood had settled me. "You said, 'Daddy and me rode the carousel.'" She laughed, as though we were not discussing the day when my childhood was broken in two, and I saw the lines on her neck around her eyes. Every few years I would turn, and just like that, see more years on her face. My father chuckled with her, but the horses were still stuck in their galloping poses. He still held that distance in his eyes, the one he kept between us, and in that distance that never stopped growing, I saw myself skating alone on the ice, and I felt those eyes following me and leaving me and pushing me forward into this, the future. The end. Thank you.